Well, a quick introduction for me. My name is Duran Smith, like the band Duran Duran, but I'm not named after the band Duran Duran. It is a family name. I have a degree in film production. I studied film production in Los Angeles at Biola University, which has a great film program, and I loved my years there. I finished my degree here in Atlanta at Georgia State University, where I also studied theater and film theory. And film is my great passion, but my other equal passion is apologetics and philosophy. And I've known I wanted to make movies and be an actor since I was 15. And that's also right about the time when I started taking the Bible seriously and started delving in and kind of followed my dad's path in terms of being analytical and critical of what I read and asking serious questions. So it wasn't until I got to Biola University that my two loves, my love for film and art and my love for apologetics and philosophy, finally it came together. And it began with me finding a little book by Francis Schaeffer, who was probably the grandfather of modern apologetics, and that little book was called Art and the Bible. Very tiny book, but it changed my life. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the things he says in there, and then I'm going to take it a little further. So first of all, I want to refer you to this quote from C.S. Lewis that you've probably heard before. It's one of those special quotes that floats around on Facebook, on the internet. It's usually got like a flower behind it or a horse or, a baby or something, where C.S. Lewis said, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex." This is the important part. "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." Now, C.S. Lewis elaborated on this in different parts of his writings, but he never really formalized it as an argument, which is something that the philosopher Peter Kreeft did. Peter Kreeft argues that the desire that C.S. Lewis is talking about can be split up into three different desires, which is what we call the three transcendentals, which are truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, beauty is the primary topic of our discussion today, the beauty and how it relates to art. So truth, when we talk about truth, we're talking about ontology. We're talking about the essence of reality itself, like the essence of things, its existence, like what it is. And that is perceived through reason. Goodness, when we talk about that, we're talking about morality or moral purity, or even the teleology of a thing, its purpose, its function. We'll talk a little bit about that later too. But that is perceived through the conscience. Beauty, I'm not going to define it for you just yet, because beauty is very tricky, and people have tried for centuries to define beauty, but this is something that I've been passionate about because I want to make movies, and I want to make beautiful movies, but what does that mean? What does it mean to make beautiful movies? Does that just mean they look pretty, or what does it mean? But for now, I will just posit to you that beauty is perceived through the imagination. When I say imagination, I'm not talking about Barney. I'm not talking about use your imagination and pretend that things are there that aren't really there. The imagination, classically understood, is actually the part of your mind or your soul that perceives meaning. Meaning as differentiated from telos. It's a slight distinction. But C.S. Lewis kind of made the distinction in this quote here. He said, "Reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning." All right, so Peter Kreeft's formalized version of this argument that I've inserted the three transcendentals into it. Premise one goes, every desire corresponds to something which can satisfy that desire. In other words, we don't have a desire unless there is something that can meet that desire. Premise two, the desire for the three transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, cannot be physically satisfied. Now, you got to think about this for a moment. Truth, goodness, and beauty are not in and of themselves physical things. They're ideas, they're concepts, they're properties, which is premise three. The three transcendentals only exist as properties. So while we do talk about truth, for example, We can talk about truth as a thing in and of itself, but when we're talking about truth, we're really talking about a property of other things. This is true, that is true. Truth is a property of the thing. Premise 4 is the three transcendentals must have a metaphysical standard and intelligent source. If it is an abstract thing, if these three transcendentals are truly transcendental, if they're abstract ideas, then those ideas need to come from somewhere. And the conclusion of this argument, just as C.S. Lewis also concludes, is that the three transcendentals are the properties of a metaphysical intellect who is their standard, who must be God. Classically speaking, philosophically argued, this is what we call God. I wish I could really dig into this because it's such an important argument. I think the argument from Desire has a lot of emotional weight to it as well. But I think the best way to approach the importance of the argument is through the subject of art. And the reason for that is because when we talk about the three transcendentals, we have, this is a little complicated, but we have the ontological order of it versus the epistemological order of it. The ontological order, on the philosophy of ontology being like the philosophy of a thing's essence, its existence, what the things depend on. So, for example, the ontological order is truth, goodness, beauty. Beauty relies on goodness to exist, and goodness relies on truth to exist. But the epistemological order is how we know, how we perceive these things. And that epistemological order is reversed. So we access truth through goodness, and we access goodness through beauty. So now the question is, how do we access beauty? Like I said, that's why art becomes the fundamental concept here. So what is art? This is my definition of art. I say that art is the intentional expression of ideas and feelings through a purposed medium. And all three of those components are very important because the expression needs to be intentional. It needs to be intentional on the part of the artist. It needs to be something that they intended to do. They need to be specifically communicating an idea or ideas or a feeling or feelings. Different kinds of arts communicate different ideas and different feelings. For example, music without words, unless you understand some kind of historical context in which the music was written, the music only communicates a feeling. Although you could translate those feelings into ideas, but that's on you. And the third part, of course, is a purposed medium. This one might be a little more tricky. If the artist is intentional about what he's expressing, the ideas and the feelings he's expressing, then he needs to have a medium that's purposed. That's what makes it art. That's what differentiates it between me just standing up here and telling you what I think and how I feel. Instead, I would have some clay to form something that would communicate that to you in an extra special way through that purposed medium. Now that we have a working definition for art, I want to talk about specifically what Francis Schaeffer inspired in me when I read his book, Art in the Bible, those years ago. A key part of that book is his 4 standards for objective criticism of art. Now this is important because, especially when we talk about art and beauty, this is something that people are always going back and forth on. Is it objective or is it subjective? We have subjective opinions about things. We have objective opinions about things. We say that beauty is objective. We say that beauty is subjective. Which is it? I'm arguing today that we can objectively criticize and analyze art while still having a subjective opinion of it. But I want to go through these categories and show you. So these 4 objective categories are technical excellence, validity, intellectual content or the worldview, and the integration of content and vehicle. Real quick, let me explain each of these to you. Technical excellence is probably the most common thing that people critique when they see a work of art, because technical excellence is the craft of the art form itself. For example, if you play piano well or you don't play piano well. If you paint, you either paint well or you don't paint well. Now, I'm not saying that you can't enjoy something that's not painted well, and I'm not saying you can't enjoy a piano piece that isn't played as well, But we all recognize the difference between good and bad when it comes to this category, and I think that it's the easiest for us to criticize. It's the most accessible. Validity is why the artist is creating the work of art and whether the artist is honest. This is important when you're critiquing art because you need to know why the artist is doing it. Now, sometimes if you're just coming to a work of art without knowing anything about it, it might be difficult to tell what the validity of the artist behind the work of art is. But sometimes you do know. Like, for example, in the Godfather trilogy, Godfather Part 3 is typically regarded as either much lesser than the other two, or sometimes we just pretend it doesn't exist. So the question is then, well, what happened? Why was Godfather Part 3 made in that case? I don't claim to be an expert on these movies, but might I suggest that the reason that Part 3 was made was because the first two both won the Oscar for Best Picture, and they were extraordinary successes both at the box office and critically speaking. So it only makes sense then to make a Part 3. Now, I'm not saying that Francis Ford Coppola was completely motivated by money or acclaim in this case. I think maybe there was a little more to it than that, but let's just say that it might be safe to say that the validity behind this work of art was maybe a little lesser than the other two. All right, intellectual content and worldview. Francis Schaeffer was a Christian apologist. So he definitely believed that when you're critiquing a work of art, you need to be able to discern what the worldview of that work of art is, and is it compatible with the Christian worldview? Now, this is an important distinction, though, because is it compatible with the Christian worldview? Francis Schaeffer isn't arguing, is it a Christian work of art? Because otherwise, most of the works of art in the world would be disqualified. No, is it compatible with the Christian worldview? Secular artists and artists from other religions, they do have some true ideas about the world. You know, they know what love is. They know that love is a good thing. So if that's what you're singing about or what you're writing about or painting about, then that's a good thing. It's compatible with Christianity insofar as it doesn't challenge the entirety of the Christian worldview. I use the Beatles as an example because they're excellent examples of the first two categories, which are technical excellence and validity. They were incredible musicians. They innovated the world of music to a degree that probably nobody else did, at least in the popular age. Their validity was incredibly high. They really believed the things that they were singing, but their worldview, they weren't Christians. They weren't Christians, and they didn't sing about Christian things. And I'm not going to say that they always flew in the face of Christianity, but sometimes it might have been lacking in that area. So worldview is important in this regard. All right, now the trickiest category is category number 4, which is content vehicle integration, because it's a mouthful. But it's not so hard to think about. When we think about content and vehicle, what we're really talking about is the content being the worldview, the message, the purpose of that work of art, and the vehicle being the craft of that work of art. What it is, how it works, how it functions, and how well are you marrying those two? How well does the message suit the medium? How well does the content suit the vehicle, and vice versa? How well does the vehicle suit the content? Now, the reason this one is tricky to define in terms of philosophy is because it's particular to each work of art. You're going to talk about content vehicle integration in a different way if you're talking about painting, which is purely visual, versus how you would talk about content vehicle integration if you're talking about filmmaking, because filmmaking is a whole bunch of different kinds of art all thrown into one. Writing, visuals, sound, performance, elocution. But category number 4 also gives us kind of a clue as to what the purpose of art is. Now, why do we make art? Going back to that argument from desire, like what do we desire from art that is important? What is that eternal desire that we just can't satisfy no matter how many works of art we watch, no matter how many movies we watch, no matter how many books we read, no matter how much music we listen to. And I listen to a lot of music. I don't know about you, but my Spotify is almost always running. What is the purpose of art? The purpose of art is the pursuit of beauty. I'm just going to go ahead and posit that to you right now. But we've got to talk about what is beauty in that case. All right, so let's talk about what is beauty. You've probably heard this quote. You've probably used this quote. Beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. Plato. The truth is, Plato didn't say that. This is a gross misrepresentation of what Plato said, but people often try to use this quote to defend the idea that beauty is subjective. That beauty, what you think is beautiful, is entirely up to you. That this person can think this is beautiful, and this person can think this is beautiful, and therefore beauty is just all around subjective. But not only do I dispute their claim, but I also dispute the quote. Why don't we just go to the source? This is what Plato actually said. But what if man had eyes to see the true beauty, the divine beauty? I mean, pure and clear and unalloyed, not clogged with the pollutions of mortality and all the colors and vanities of human life, thither looking and holding converse with the true beauty, simple and divine. Remember how in that communion only, beholding beauty with the eye of the mind, he will be enabled to bring forth not images of beauty, but realities. For he has hold not of an image, but of a reality. Thank you. No. What Plato is saying here is, to make the distinction between the gross misrepresentation of his quote, Plato is making an epistemological claim. He's not making an ontological claim. Remember those words? When people say beauty lies in the eye of the beholder, therefore beauty is subjective, they're making an ontological claim about the nature of beauty. But that's not even what Plato was saying. He was making an epistemological claim. He said beauty can only be perceived through the eye of the mind. It can only be known through the eye of the mind. He actually hasn't really said much about what beauty is. So when we're talking about what is beauty then, so we know that beauty is a property of things. It can only be known through the mind. That's what Plato said, and I would tend to agree. This other Greek philosopher named Plotinus, he wrote a little more extensively about beauty than Plato did, and I wish I could just read you all of his stuff, but I can't. But he begins to challenge the notion of, well, how do we define beauty? What is it exactly? To what attributes of a thing, what properties of a thing can we pick out and say, well, that's the beauty of it? One common one that a lot of people use, and they don't realize that Plotinus already disputed it a long time ago, is symmetry. That there's an order, a symmetry to things. You've probably seen this kind of picture before in nature or in works of art. It's called the golden ratio. But Plotinus says, can we doubt that beauty is something more than symmetry? That symmetry itself owes its beauty to a remoter principle? I think Plotinus is onto something here. Another version of describing beauty that came about as a result of pragmatism, which was a result of postmodernism in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we don't have time to go there, is this idea that form follows function. This phrase came from an architect named Louis Sullivan. And so he was specifically talking about architecture when he wrote this, but now it's kind of become a philosophical mantra, form ever follows function. What he's saying is that when you're building a building, you need it to function as a building first. Like you need to lay the foundation well. You need to build the columns well, the pillars well. You know, the pillars and the walls need to hold up the ceiling. Once you've figured out how to do that, then you can decorate it. Once you've got the function right, then you can add the form. Then you can decide whether or not you want the pillars to be round or square. So a lot of people have posited that beauty is this combination of form and function. I think that's close. But I think we need to make a finer distinction on it. The philosopher Roger Scruton pointed out that you cannot determine an object's beauty without first determining its purpose. Now this is a really interesting idea, and it would seem to kind of fall in line with this idea of form ever follows function. Because if you don't know what a thing is, it's hard to say whether or not it's beautiful. And you may have probably never been in this predicament before. You've probably rarely looked at a thing and said, what is that? and wondered if it's beautiful or not. You can't determine whether or not it's beautiful unless you know what it is. He uses an example of somebody giving you a dull wooden object and you can't quite tell what it is. And he says, well, if somebody told you that it was a knife, but it's just a dull wooden object, you would say, well, it's a rather ugly knife. It doesn't work, right? But if you say, oh, it's actually a shoehorn, it's used for getting your shoe off, then, oh, well, suddenly that makes more sense. Well, oh, it's a very finely crafted shoehorn. So what do these things imply about taste then? Now, taste is a big mystery. When people talk about taste, I think we like to talk about ice cream. Ice cream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. Ice cream for vanilla, and people think that makes me boring. Oh, okay. Well. Other people really like chocolate. So is that all that beauty really is? Is it really just a subjective preference between vanilla and chocolate in ice cream? I say no. You haven't said anything about the beauty of the ice cream itself. All you've said is that you prefer vanilla. But that doesn't say anything about the thing itself. That only says something about you. I mean, if we're going to talk about vanilla and chocolate ice cream, they both have the same function. And they both have very similar forms. Taste would be, I think, in the form category. So just keep in mind that if somebody ever says that something is subjectively beautiful or beauty is subjective, consider what they're actually saying. They're probably saying something more about themselves than they're actually saying about the thing. So what is beauty then? Here's my definition of beauty. Beauty is the manifest potential integration of truth and goodness. Thank you. All right, that's a mouthful, so I'm going to have to explain. I believe that the three transcendentals are not really three, they're actually two. The truth and goodness. And beauty is just the two of them together. It's just the integration of them together. Truth, the essence, the ontology of a thing, and goodness, the teleology and the goodness of the thing combine. It is the content-vehicle integration. Remember that from talking about art? The content-vehicle integration. Truth being the vehicle and goodness being the content, integrated. But when we're talking about beauty in a wider sense, outside of art, let's say in nature, in the created world, this goes back to the idea of the Platonic ideal. Everything has a potential integration for its purpose and its meaning to be combined with its essence. But not all things, because we live in a fallen world, not all things perfectly do that. So that's why I say it's the potential integration, but it's the amount of that potential integration that is manifest, that is actually manifested before you. So that's why we can look at a thing and say that it's beautiful, but it could be more beautiful, because we are able to perceive, through the eyes of our mind, what that thing could be. That is my definition of beauty. That's the technical definition. I would use the manifest potential integration, or MPI, to give it a unit or something. But the poetic expression would be the divine idea manifest. The divine idea being the version of that thing that God would have made, that would have been holy and perfect, and the amount of that is manifest in that thing. I remember the night that phrase hit me, the divine idea manifest. I had been reading Plotinus, and I fell on my knees, because suddenly the world around me completely changed. It went from being a world of just things to a world that was full of art forms, full of things that God had made and people had made. And everything becomes art, and everything starts glimmering with its own beauty of whatever MPI of beauty that it has. I go into a little more detail about a thing's potential. I think that things have, you could think of MPI as a thing's weight of beauty. You could think of it, of beauty in terms of like pounds. I think that's a fair metaphor. I also think it's the best way to think about beauty as being objective instead of subjective. I don't think that all objective things are measurable, but I think that the only reason that we couldn't measure something like beauty is just because there are so many properties and parts of things that are just difficult to explain and define, especially when it comes to the essence of a thing. We're talking more about just its atoms, and especially the purpose of a thing, because I think it's tough for us to know the purpose of all things, or all the purposes of some things even. But the point is I would say this, is that when it comes to beauty, I think it is possible for us to exercise our discernment for beauty so that we can lift more of it. It comes with practice. I mean, if you've ever wondered why an artsy person, maybe like me, could watch a really weird movie and cry at the end, and you're like, what the heck is going on? Well, it's probably because they're a little more used to the film medium. They're a little more used to being able to look at that medium and really get something out of it, because they're looking at different parts. If you begin to dwell on this, begin to consider things objective beauty instead of just how it makes you feel, I think you'll begin to get a higher sense of what beauty is. And my defense for this somewhat would be another C.S. Lewis quote, where he says that it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong but too weak, as we're not lifting enough. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. We are too easily satisfied with the light beauties and not the heavy beauties. One other interesting part of beauty that Plato pointed out is, so Plato actually thought that beauty and eros, the version of love that's between a man and a woman, are actually the same thing, more or less. And the reason he thought that is because there's a peculiar quality of beauty that beckons to us to become one with it. You've probably never consciously thought about this when you see something beautiful, but when you see something beautiful, you desire a communion with that thing. You desire to kind of put it on, like a fancy dress or a fancy suit. You desire to become part of that thing. Now, I don't think that the way that Plato described it was exactly right. I don't think that beauty is the same as eros, because I think that eros is more of an action, whereas beauty is a part of a thing. But I think it's a pretty good metaphor, and it's something that C.S. Lewis tapped into in his extraordinary essay, The Weight of Glory, which I would highly recommend everybody go home and read right now. It's like 25 pages long. You probably find a PDF of it online. It's extraordinary. I personally think that it is C.S. Lewis's magnum opus. It represents everything he believed in, everything he was trying to accomplish through his art of writing and telling stories, and how that fits in with his concept of the glory of God. But what he says is that the poets and the mythologies know all about it. We do not want merely to see beauty, though God knows, even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. If we take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star and cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, to put on immortality, as Paul said, then we may surmise that both the ancient myths and the modern poetry, so false as history, may be very near the truth as prophecy. And so I say to you that someday God will redeem and resurrect us with our full manifest potential integration, our full MPI. We will go from the broken, depraved creatures that we are now into the glorious resurrected creatures that he intended for us to be. So what do I say to you today? I say, pursue beauty. Because that is the purpose of art, the pursuit of beauty. And you are art. Yes?
Von Goethe had a much simpler way to approach this, and I think
Who did?
Johann Wolfgang von Goethe.
Okay.
So he's kind of a guy. Check him out. But he, in his work about artistic criticism, he said there are three things you need to know about art. What is the artist trying to do, which attends to your message? How well does he do it, which attends to your technical? And then he takes your last two and puts them into one. Is it worth doing? And I think if, as consumers of art, we need to be focused on that final one, that is it worth doing? Because if it's done well and the message is clear, that's fine. But if it's not worth doing, then it's really not worth our consumption.
I would absolutely agree. And the reason is because I think that is why Francis Schaeffer specifically included the Christian worldview part of the criticism, is because if that thing, a work of art can be very well done, but if it is harmful in the sense that it could bring you temptation or bring you doubts, and those kinds of things are going to be subjective to each person. That's the kind of thing that each person is going to have to be mindful of on their own, because we're all coming from different places in our life. We're all at different points where this movie might be great for me but not for you, and this movie might be terrible for me but good for you. But I think that the point of Schaeffer's four standards is actually to say whether or not that thing was worth doing or having in the first place. Like something like I like to analyze movies with these four categories, so I use a 4-star system. So I say that, The Lord of the Rings is 4 stars. It was totally worth doing. But Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, that was a cash grab, and it was terrible, and the dinosaurs looked completely fake, and none of the jokes were funny. And it was just bad. And it didn't even necessarily, oppose the Christian worldview. It was just a bad movie. So was it worth doing? Well, I guess if you just wanted the money, but no, it wasn't really worth doing. So that is the purpose of objective criticism, is to say whether or not it is worth it.
Just 2 comments here. The first one is you take, for beauty, you take into account the intentions of an agent. I was just thinking this might be a problem for open theists who deny that God can know the future, because things that he didn't intend can be thwarted, or things that he didn't intend can happen. So that's just one thing. Another thing is, I was just concerned about the necessary condition of truth. I don't think there's enough nuance to that, because when I think, if something is beautiful if it's true and good, I was just thinking about just fictional stories where magic happens. It seems like the issue there is you can cherry pick the true message that it's coming out, but it's teaching you false things like magic or whatever.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's an entirely different presentation that I have to give. The issue with that is the art of storytelling. Remember how I said that each different form of art has a different version of content vehicle integration? Obviously, if you're working with a fictional story, you've already suspended belief in the literal historical truth of that thing. That's what fiction is. It's a suspension of the historical truth of the thing. So when it comes to storytelling, the truth of the story that you're looking for is not its historical truth, it's its moral truth, it's its worldview truth, which is why you can have something like Lord of the Rings that is completely fictional and false, historically absurd. But as a work of, since J.R.R. Tolkien was a Catholic, as a supreme work of Catholic art, I think the worldview that he presents in The Lord of the Rings is spectacular and wonderful and beautiful, and every bit as true, every bit as meaningfully true as, say, the true story of, soldiers fighting in World War II. So that's you just have to differentiate between the different kind of art that you're talking about. And that, I think that's the nuance you're looking for.
Grant, we're out of time. If you mind, if you will close us in prayer, that'd be great.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lord, I thank you for these people. I thank you that they have a heart for loving you and for loving the truth that you have given us and for using the gift of reason that you have blessed us with. And Lord, I pray that as we go out, you would fill these people with your Spirit to love the people around them and to acknowledge that the people around them are made in your image. They are works of art with the Imago Dei, and that people would be able to love each other better because they can see that in each other. Lord, I pray that you would bless everybody here with a closer communion with you, Lord. And I pray that you would draw us ever closer to your love and your truth. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Very good. Thanks.